Looking at the world map, imagine a fortress surrounded by vast lands and completely isolated. Many mainstream financial experts argued that if this fortress severed its ties with the outside world, the system would collapse from within. However, the reality is far beyond theoretical models, existing in a much more complex structure. Russia is not just a country. It has become a living laboratory for an economy pushed out of the global financial system, showing how it creates its own alternative veins. Today, we will analyze step by step how a major power challenges the established set of rules and turns the loopholes of the system to its own advantage. The question is this: does an economy die when it is cut off from global networks, or does it transform into a completely different player that sets its own rules? Let's look behind the curtain of this great isolation. Everything started with the collapse of the USSR's massive, centrally planned economy. At that time, the Soviet system functioned like an enormous machine operated from a single control room. Nearly every important economic decision, from industrial production to transportation and pricing, was directed by the state. While this centralized structure often sacrificed efficiency, it also provided a sense of predictability. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that entire mechanism did not gradually slow down, it broke apart almost overnight. Supply chains disappeared, factories suddenly found themselves without customers or raw materials, and millions of people faced an uncertain future unlike anything they had experienced before. The transition that followed became known as shock therapy, but for ordinary citizens, it felt less like economic reform and more like economic survival. Inflation erased savings that families had accumulated over decades. State-owned enterprises were rapidly privatized, and strategic industries changed hands at breathtaking speed. A small group of businessmen accumulated enormous wealth, while millions watched the value of their wages collapse. During those years, many Russians lost confidence, not only in financial institutions, but also in the idea that global economic integration alone could guarantee prosperity. During that period, the black market became more than an illegal marketplace. It became an alternative economic system. Empty supermarket shelves forced people to exchange goods directly. Food was traded for fuel, machinery was exchanged for raw materials, and foreign currencies often became more trusted than the domestic ruble. Gold, dollars, and even everyday products sometimes functioned as money because confidence in official institutions had nearly disappeared. Entire communities developed informal trading networks simply to meet basic needs. These experiences left behind a powerful lesson that became deeply rooted in the country's collective memory. If the official system fails, people will eventually create another one. What we are witnessing today is, in many ways, the modern version of that same instinct. The difference is that instead of relying on neighborhood barter markets, today's alternatives involve digital payment systems, state-backed financial institutions, commodity-based trade, and carefully designed international partnerships. The philosophy, however, remains remarkably similar. Rather than depending entirely on external systems, Russia has increasingly attempted to build mechanisms that can continue functioning even if access to global networks becomes restricted. The economic chaos of the 1990s also transformed the way Russian policymakers viewed strategic assets. When people remember how major oil companies, factories, mines, and industrial infrastructure changed ownership during privatization, they better understand why today's leadership places such a strong emphasis on state oversight. The lesson learned from that period was simple but powerful. If a nation loses control of its strategic industries, it risks losing control over its own future. That memory continues to influence economic decision-making decades later. As a result, sectors considered essential for national security such as energy production, transportation infrastructure, banking, telecommunications, and defense manufacturing are no longer viewed purely as commercial businesses. Instead, they are treated as strategic pillars that must remain resilient during periods of international pressure. This does not necessarily mean eliminating markets altogether. Rather, it represents the emergence of what many analysts describe as a hybrid economic model where private enterprise continues to exist, but the state maintains significant influence over industries considered critical for national stability. In many ways, the Soviet model of direct central planning has evolved into something different. Instead of controlling every factory and every price, the modern approach focuses on supervising strategic sectors while allowing market forces to operate elsewhere. Supporters argue that this balance provides flexibility without sacrificing national security. Critics, however, contend that excessive state involvement can reduce innovation, discourage competition, and create long-term inefficiencies. Regardless of which perspective one adopts, there is little doubt that Russia's economic philosophy today differs substantially from the free market trajectory many expected after the collapse of the Soviet Union. One important aspect is often overlooked when discussing this transformation. In today's world, economic strength is no longer measured solely by GDP growth or stock market performance. Increasingly, resilience has become just as important as efficiency. Governments now ask different questions than they did 30 years ago. Can the banking system continue operating if international payment networks become unavailable? Can domestic industries manufacture critical components without relying on foreign suppliers? Can energy exports continue reaching customers through alternative transportation routes if traditional markets become inaccessible? Can financial transactions still be completed if access to major reserve currencies becomes limited? For Russia, these questions gradually became more important than maximizing short-term economic growth. The objective shifted from achieving the lowest production costs to reducing strategic vulnerability. Policymakers increasingly accepted that certain decisions might reduce efficiency in the present if they increased resilience in the future. In other words, economic security began to carry nearly the same weight as economic profitability. This shift in priorities would eventually shape almost every major policy that followed. The real test of this new philosophy, however, would not come from domestic reforms alone. It would emerge when Russia found itself facing unprecedented international sanctions and financial restrictions that challenged nearly every connection it had with the global economy. Instead of responding with a single policy, the country began constructing an entirely different economic architecture, one designed not to replace globalization completely, but to survive even when access to it became severely limited. It is at this point that the story becomes far more complex than conventional economic theory ever predicted, because the question was no longer whether Russia could remain connected to the existing system, but whether it could gradually build an alternative alongside it. So, is it really possible for a major economy to function outside the traditional global financial system? At first glance, many economists would argue that the answer is no. The modern world is deeply interconnected through international banking, reserve currencies, global shipping routes, and multinational supply chains. Remove access to these networks, and most economies would be expected to contract dramatically. However, Russia has attempted something different. Rather than trying to defeat the existing system head-on, it has focused on reducing its dependence on the parts of that system that are most vulnerable to external pressure. Instead of relying on a single financial highway, it has begun constructing multiple alternative roads. One of the most significant areas of this transformation involves international payments. For decades, global trade has relied heavily on reserve currencies, particularly the US dollar. This has provided efficiency and liquidity, but has also concentrated enormous influence within the existing financial architecture. As restrictions increased, Russia accelerated efforts to expand the use of local currencies in trade with selected partners. Bilateral agreements denominated in national currencies became increasingly important, allowing transactions to bypass some of the traditional channels dominated by Western financial institutions. Although these arrangements do not replace the global financial system, they reduce dependence on it in specific sectors and between certain trading partners. Gold has also played a strategic role in this broader approach. Rather than viewing gold simply as a profitable investment, policymakers increasingly treat it as a reserve asset capable of strengthening financial stability during periods of uncertainty. Unlike digital bank balances that depend on international financial networks, physical gold remains an asset that is not directly tied to the liabilities of another country. This is why many analysts describe gold not merely as a commodity but as a financial insurance policy. In times of geopolitical tension, such reserves can increase confidence in a country's financial position even when access to external capital becomes more limited. At the same time, domestic financial infrastructure has received enormous attention. Payment systems, banking technology, and financial messaging networks have gradually been expanded to reduce reliance on foreign platforms. The objective is not necessarily to isolate the country completely, but to ensure that essential financial services continue functioning even if access to international systems becomes disrupted. Economic resilience in this context is built through redundancy. Just as engineers design backup systems for critical infrastructure, governments increasingly seek backup mechanisms for finance. Trade itself has also become far more complex than many people imagine. When sanctions affect direct commercial routes, businesses often begin searching for indirect ones. This is where logistics becomes just as important as finance. Goods rarely travel in perfectly straight lines from producer to consumer. Instead, they move through warehouses, distribution centers, ports, rail terminals, and processing facilities spread across multiple countries. Every additional stop creates opportunities for commercial restructuring, legal compliance checks, and changes in ownership before products finally reach their destination. Think about the enormous container ships constantly moving across the world's oceans. Every day, millions of containers pass through major ports, changing vessels' operators and destinations. In this vast network, the movement of goods can become extraordinarily complicated. Certain transit hubs, sometimes referred to as transshipment centers, play an especially important role. Products may arrive in one country, undergo additional processing, be combined with other shipments, or simply continue their journey under newly organized commercial documentation, depending on the legal requirements of international trade. These complex supply chains illustrate how globalization itself has created a highly flexible logistics environment. Another remarkable aspect is the speed at which global trade adapts under pressure. History repeatedly demonstrates that whenever one commercial route becomes more difficult, businesses begin searching for another. Markets naturally seek the path of least resistance. This creates an ongoing cycle in which regulations become increasingly sophisticated, while commercial innovation evolves just as rapidly. Financial restrictions therefore resemble an extended chess match rather than a permanent solution. Every new obstacle encourages governments, companies, logistics providers, and financial intermediaries to redesign the way international transactions are conducted. In this environment, adaptability becomes one of the most valuable strategic assets a nation can possess. Energy exports provide another important example. Russia remains one of the world's largest producers of oil, natural gas, and numerous raw materials that are essential for industrial economies. Even when traditional buyers reduce purchases, global demand for energy does not simply disappear overnight. Instead, trade flows often begin shifting toward different regions, sometimes requiring entirely new transportation corridors, insurance arrangements, financing structures, and long-term commercial partnerships. Building these alternative networks requires massive investments in railways, pipelines, port facilities, shipping capacity, and storage infrastructure. Such projects are expensive and time-consuming, but they reflect a broader strategy aimed at increasing long-term flexibility. This strategy extends beyond physical infrastructure. Domestic manufacturing has become another priority, reducing dependence on imported technologies, industrial components, and critical machinery has encouraged greater investment in local production capabilities. While replacing advanced foreign technologies is rarely quick or easy, governments facing prolonged external pressure often conclude that strategic independence justifies higher costs. Local software platforms, domestic payment processors, industrial research programs, and national technology initiatives therefore become more than economic policies. They become part of a wider national resilience strategy. The guiding principle behind this approach is relatively straightforward. If access to one system becomes uncertain, create additional systems capable of performing similar functions. Instead of assuming that globalization will always operate under stable conditions, policymakers increasingly prepare for periods when international cooperation becomes more fragmented. Whether these parallel systems ultimately prove as efficient as the global networks they supplement remains uncertain. However, from a strategic perspective, their primary objective is not maximum efficiency but continuity. As this new economic architecture expanded, it gradually influenced almost every aspect of national planning. Logistics, finance, technology, manufacturing, and energy were no longer treated as separate policy areas. They became interconnected components of a broader strategy designed to strengthen resilience against external shocks. Yet every major transformation comes with consequences. Building self-sufficiency often requires significant public investment, changes in consumer behavior, and difficult economic trade-offs. Those costs would become increasingly visible not only in government budgets but also in the daily lives of ordinary citizens, setting the stage for the next phase of Russia's economic transformation. As we have discussed throughout this analysis, every major transformation comes with a price. Building an economy that is less dependent on global financial networks is not simply a matter of changing trade routes or creating alternative payment systems. It requires a complete redistribution of national resources. Capital, labor, technology, and public investment are gradually redirected toward sectors that the state considers strategically essential. This process inevitably changes the financial structure of society itself, and the effects are often felt most strongly by the middle class. When governments prioritize resilience over efficiency, investment naturally shifts toward industries that strengthen long-term national security. Energy production, transportation infrastructure, heavy industry, defense, manufacturing, and domestic technology receive greater attention, while sectors driven primarily by consumer demand may experience slower growth. Elon Metin. The result is an economy that becomes increasingly focused on production capacity and strategic independence rather than maximizing consumption. For many households, this translates into changing spending habits, fewer imported products, and a growing reliance on locally manufactured alternatives. Foreign brands that once dominated supermarket shelves gradually give way to domestic producers or companies from new trading partners. Consumers adapt to different choices, businesses reorganize their supply chains, and entrepreneurs begin looking for opportunities within the changing economic landscape. These adjustments rarely happen overnight. Instead, they unfold gradually, becoming part of everyday life until what once seemed temporary begins to feel normal. Financial behavior also evolves during periods of prolonged uncertainty. When inflation, currency fluctuations, or geopolitical risks become major concerns, households often begin placing greater importance on assets they perceive as more stable over the long term. Gold, real estate, agricultural land, and other tangible resources may receive increased attention because they are viewed as stores of value during uncertain times. Whether these choices ultimately prove beneficial depends on future economic conditions. But the underlying motivation remains the same: preserving purchasing power in an unpredictable environment. Perhaps the most significant transformation is psychological rather than financial. When businesses and families expect external uncertainty to continue for many years, they begin making decisions based on resilience instead of convenience. Companies establish relationships with domestic suppliers even when imported alternatives appear more competitive. Investors become increasingly interested in industries supported by long-term government priorities. Universities expand research in strategic technologies. Manufacturers redesign production processes around locally available materials. Step by step, these decisions reshape the structure of the economy itself. Over time, what initially begins as an emergency response can evolve into a permanent economic culture. A country that once viewed globalization as its primary path to growth gradually begins viewing self-reliance as an equally important objective. Whether this transition ultimately produces greater prosperity or simply greater stability remains one of the most important economic questions of the coming decades. History provides examples supporting both outcomes, reminding us that there is no universal formula for national development. Another important consequence of this transformation is the changing relationship between the state and private capital. In highly globalized economies, markets often play the leading role in directing investment. Under conditions of prolonged geopolitical pressure, however, governments frequently become more active participants in determining national priorities. Public investment, industrial policy, and strategic planning gain greater importance as policymakers seek to accelerate development in sectors considered vital for long-term resilience. Supporters of this approach argue that markets alone cannot always guarantee national security. They point out that critical industries such as energy, transportation, semiconductor production, communications, and defense may require long-term investments that private companies are reluctant to make without government support. Critics respond that excessive state involvement can reduce competition, discourage innovation, and create inefficiencies that eventually slow economic growth. This debate is far from unique to Russia. Versions of it are taking place in many countries as governments reconsider the balance between globalization and national resilience. It is also important to recognize that no economy exists in complete isolation. Even countries seeking greater independence continue trading, investing, and cooperating with international partners. The objective is rarely total economic separation. Instead, it is the reduction of vulnerabilities that could threaten national stability during periods of crisis. But about how much dependence any country is willing to accept in exchange for the benefits of international integration. The Russian experience illustrates this dilemma in a particularly visible way. Faced with significant external pressure, the country has attempted to redesign parts of its economic system around resilience, diversification, and strategic autonomy. Some policies have produced measurable successes, while others continue to face substantial challenges. Building alternative financial infrastructure, expanding trade with new partners, and increasing domestic production all require enormous resources and long-term commitment. The ultimate effectiveness of these efforts will only become clear over many years. What makes this story especially significant is that it extends far beyond one nation. Around the world, governments are paying closer attention to supply chain security, domestic manufacturing, critical technologies, and financial independence than they did only a decade ago. The global economy itself appears to be entering a period in which efficiency is no longer the only priority. Resilience, redundancy, and strategic flexibility are becoming equally valuable concepts. Whether this represents a temporary adjustment or the beginning of a deeper transformation remains one of the defining questions of our time. The Russian example therefore offers an important lesson. When an established system excludes a major participant, that participant does not always disappear. Sometimes it begins searching for entirely new ways to operate. Sometimes it adapts. Sometimes it innovates. And occasionally, those adaptations influence the evolution of the global system itself. History repeatedly reminds us that economic orders are not permanent. They change, often gradually, through technological innovation, political shifts, and the strategic decisions of nations responding to new realities. So, is Russia building the foundation of a lasting alternative economic model, or is it simply developing temporary mechanisms designed to endure an exceptionally difficult period? The answer remains uncertain, and economists continue to debate it intensely. What is clear, however, is that the global financial system is proving to be far more dynamic than many once assumed. New payment systems, new trading relationships, new transportation corridors, and new economic alliances are reshaping parts of the international landscape in ways that few predicted only a generation ago. As we reach the end of this analysis, remember one thing. Money has never been merely paper, metal, or digital code displayed on a screen. Throughout history, it has represented influence, trust, sovereignty, and power. Financial systems are not simply collections of banks and currencies. They are reflections of political choices, strategic priorities, and national ambitions. The strongest structures are often those that remain invisible until they are tested. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this analysis and want to explore the hidden mechanisms shaping the global economy, be sure to subscribe and join us for the next episode. Until then, keep questioning what lies beneath the surface. Because the most important forces influencing our world are often the ones we cannot immediately see.